Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Teletubbies Iceberg. This is the third and final part of this series, and today we will be covering the topics in tiers 7, 8, 9, and 10. Ain't nothing else to say except grab some snacks, sit back, and enjoy. The first entry on tier 7 is YouTube 360 videos. Apparently, there's a genre of videos on YouTube that take the Teletubbies, mix it with horror elements, and make 360-degree videos. Here's an example. For the next entry, horror parodies, there are a couple different things for this. First, there's this Reddit post talking about how this guy remembers watching a Teletubbies episode where, at the end of the episode, one Teletubby kills the others with a knife. The comments were all telling him he was either on shrooms or that he must have been watching a parody. Second, there are a lot of short films that turn the Teletubbies into a horror genre, like this. Po is one of the major antagonists in the Teletubbies series behind Nunu. As far as the lore goes, Po was killed at the hand of Tinky Winky, although this is disputed in different games where it shows Po offing himself. Either way, he becomes infected and was forced to be Nunu's bodyguard, and eventually dies at the hand of the Guardian, if you get the good ending. Here is Po pre-infection, Undead Po, Spider Po, Necro Po, and Po hanging from a tree. The Teletubbies sure are terrifying, but for real, this entry was really too vague for me to find anything specific for it, so enjoy this picture instead. The first entry on tier 8 is called Bullying, and I'm not sure why this is as far down in the iceberg as it is, but apparently there's this fan-made episode where the Teletubbies were being bullied and had their ball stolen, and they wanted to get revenge. Barney, who is a bear, teaches the bully named D. Sam Steelmeister how to be nicer. And that's it for this entry. For Teletubbies Tinky Winky Face, see entry 4 of tier 2, which is in my first video. The third entry on tier 8 is called Teletubby Land Without the Teletubbies, and I believe that the idea behind this entry is that Teletubby Land without the Teletubbies looks uncanny, giving off kind of a backrooms / liminal space vibe, and honestly, they're kind of right. It seems too artificial for a real landscape. The fourth and final entry on tier 8 is called Teletubbies Intro Without the Voice / Teletubbies. I couldn't find a video on YouTube that fit this description, but I imagine it would be similar to the last entry with a liminal-esque vibe. People are also kind of obsessed with making weird remixes of the intro song. The Teletubbies also performed at Britain's Got Talent. Now for the second entry of tier 9, Scary Moments, I apologize for the repeat, but I'm pretty sure that this is referring to the Lion and the Bear episode, which I covered in part 1. The third and final entry on tier 9 is called Teletubbies Infected Versions. This is more so focusing on the characters that become infected in the Teletubbies series, and there are a bunch of them, so I'm gonna rapidly fire them off. We've got the Arrow Tubby, Berserker Newborn, Cave Tubby, Dipsy, Lala, Newborns, Newborn General, Phantom Newborn, Po, Ranged Newborn, Runner Newborn, Scorpion Newborn, the Guardian, Tinky Winky, the Workers, and the Yeti Tubby. All of these characters were exposed to Tubby Custard, which, if you didn't know, was altered by Nunu to create monsters, thus leading to what we call the infection. So I'm just gonna get this out of the way since this is the last tier. The last Teletubbies episode is an entry that I already covered in entry 4 of tier 6, which was in my part 2 video of this iceberg.
Go watch it.
Now the second entry of the final tier of this iceberg is called the Guardian. Throughout all of the games and the characters, the Guardian is the main protagonist in the Teletubbies series. His main job before the whole Tubby Custard incident, was to monitor Teletubby Land and the creatures within it, as part of an unknown organization for an experiment. He also monitors the Teletubbies' behavior as well as prevents them from leaving the mainland, and we see what is beyond Teletubby Land in Chapter 2 of the Slendytubbies 3 game. The Guardian can face 4 endings, all of which are in the last chapter of the Slendytubbies 3 game. He can fight with the military in the good ending, he can end up as a corpse in the bad ending, he can become the infected version in the evil ending, or become the Crawler Tubby in the regretful ending. I hope we get a lot more lore for the Guardian in the next installment of the series, since we really don't know much about him. And now for the final entry of the final tier of the final part of this iceberg. The Slendytubbies games. It has occurred to me that in part 1, I merely explained the lore of the Slendytubbies, not the games themselves. So, I will be explaining what I believe to be the canon games, which are Slendytubbies, Slendytubbies 2D, Slendytubbies 2, Slendytubbies 3, Slendytubbies Guardian Collection, and Slendytubbies Worlds. We will start off with Slendytubbies, which was released on December 12th, 2012. Holy shit, I'm old. In Slendytubbies, the plot goes as follows. Tinky Winky started acting strange after consuming a serving of Tubby Custard, went on to kill Dipsy and Lala, and Po, in lieu of getting killed by Tinky Winky, hangs himself, and 2 officers, who are known as the Guardian and the White Teletubby, yes they are identical, were sent to investigate the grounds where this happened. The gameplay is very similar to Slenderman, the 8 pages, and the player has to collect 10 Tubby Custards while trying to avoid Tinky Winky, and locking eyes with him for too long will cause a player to get caught and subsequently killed. There is also an online multiplayer mode, and one of the game modes sets the player as Tinky Winky, and that sounds pretty fun. Now moving on to Slendytubbies 2, which was released on May 1st, 2014, this game is considered partially canon, as some of the information doesn't track consistently through Slendytubbies 3, but I am still including it because it is still a part of the overall lore. Concerning the plot, it is said to have happened 5 years after the events of the first game, though this is different in Slendytubbies 3, which is why the game is considered only partially canon, and the player has been researching the events of the first game. The player believes that he found the reason for Tinky Winky's madness. The Tubby Custards. The player then travels to Teletubby Land, which is desolate and swamp-like now, to collect custards for more research. However, a secret passage is uncovered, and they find freshly made custards. As you collect those custards, you find out that this passage holds technology that genetically creates Teletubbies and controls Teletubby Land. As far as the gameplay is concerned, it is pretty similar to the first game, but instead of just a flashlight, the player now has a night vision camera with a built-in flashlight. There are also new maps as well as new enemy behavior, but again, the gameplay is similar to that of the first installment. As for Slendytubbies 2D, which was released on August 31st, 2015, there is no new plot, since the game is just a remake of its predecessors with a top-down pixelated style. It does add new maps and monsters though. I'm just going to import the explanation I did for this game from my first video. Now, the lore for the third game, Slendytubbies 3, is lengthy, so bear with me as it has a campaign with multiple chapters. Alright, so, Chapter 0, titled It Was Good. The player takes on the role of Po, where Po notices Tinky Winky get up in the middle of the night, destroy the Tubby Custard machine, and leave the house. Po can either wake up Lala and Dipsy or venture out to look for Tinky Winky on his own. If Po goes out to look on his own, he will return to the house to find Dipsy's headless body, and then Tinky Winky will kill Po. After this, the Guardian appears, and the player needs to collect Tubby Custards in order to prevent things from getting worse. If the player decides to wake up the other 2 Teletubbies before going out to look for Tinky Winky, Lala tells Po to grab a builder's torch, which acts as a flashlight. Dipsy decides to stay at the house in case Tinky Winky comes back, and Po and Lala exit the house and begin a search. Po and Lala split up, and after Po finds nothing and turns back to get with Lala, he finds Tinky Winky facing with his back to him, with Lala's lifeless body on the ground, blood leaking from their eye sockets. The player will be forced to run back to the house where they find Dipsy decapitated. Sorry, Dipsy, there is no ending where you aren't headless. And Po ends up dying no matter how far the player runs, and the POV goes back to the Guardian. And that's the end of Chapter 0. Chapter 1, titled A New Day, is where the quote-unquote real story begins, since Chapter 0 is kind of like a prelude. In Chapter 1, you play as the Guardian, and your goal is to collect Tubby Custards before it's too late.
The player is trapped in the control room of a secret lair and must sneak past two newborns, which are Teletubbies that have been recently created by the creation machines, which are machines that create newborns, and are led by the newborn general. After the player makes it past, they need to find 5 Tubby custards, each in different locations. Upon finding the last one, Tinky Winky will actually eat that custard, chase the player, and the player has to escape to what's called the outskirts. That is the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, titled The Journey, has a couple different routes to start. At the end of Chapter 1, when the player must escape to what's called the outskirts, they can either choose to go through the mountains or through the cave. If the player chooses to run the mountain route, they run into a beast and get dragged away and awaken to have a conversation with a droid called Unit 437. 437 explains that the beast that knocked him out is called the Yeti Tubby, who was an experimental subject along with 2 other subjects, the Cave Tubby and the Arrow Tubby. When the player tries to escape, Unit 437 alerts the Yeti where a chase sequence occurs, and the player has to avoid going to areas where there is screaming, and if successful, they escape to the outskirts. Now, if the player doesn't go through the mountains, they have to go through the cave where the Cave Tubby is lurking. The cave is a huge maze where the player has to avoid running into the Cave Tubby and can find notes scattered around that were written by one of the experiments, which is presumed to be the Arrow Tubby. Eventually, the player is chased by the Cave Tubby once they go far enough, and escaping the cave leads to the outskirts. Now, once the player has reached the outskirts, they will meet up with Lala, and depending on whether or not the player had decided to wake her up in Chapter 0, she will have different appearances. If the player had woken her up, Lala will appear in an infected state, and the player needs to collect 8 Tubby custards without making any noise, since Lala is blind and will kill the player if she hears them. After 8 Tubby custards are collected, the player can either choose to kill Lala or leave her trapped where they found her. If the player had chosen not to wake her up in Chapter 0, Lala will not be infected. However, she admits to having eaten one of the infected custards and knows that she will mutate soon. Again, the goal is to find 8 Tubby custards, and once that task is completed, the player can either choose to put Lala out of her misery or leave her to mutate. Either way, the player leaves and goes to the satellite station, and that is the end of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, called Run Away, is the final chapter in the game. When the player enters a satellite station, there is a blue Teletubby and a security laser, and the objective here is to enter the secret center to contact the military. The blue Teletubby is named Ron, and he explains that the corpses around the facility are secret center workers, and they were all killed by a headless monster with a chainsaw. The player is informed that they need to nab a key card from one of the dead workers in order to access the secret center. After the player leaves Ron, a chainsaw can be heard and Ron is killed. After the player finds the key card, they begin hallucinating seeing Po, Lala, Tinky Winky, and Dipsy in their regular fashion. That is, not infected, not headless, with all their eyes, all that good stuff. It reveals that Dipsy is the headless monster that is killing everybody, and once the player leads the monster to a laser, it is killed and the player picks up the chainsaw. Upon entering the secret center, Nunu and a voice trumpet are seen, and Nunu admits to the player that he is the cause of everything. Nunu then leaves the room and the player has to fight the voice trumpet. When the player wins, they have a conversation with the blue vacuum and learn that Nunu is responsible for creating an army of newborns who will take over the land and is given an ultimatum: either join him in his reign or fight. If the player chooses to fight Nunu, one of 2 endings can happen. First, Nunu sends Po out to fight, and if the player defeats Po, they will proceed to destroy Nunu with a chainsaw. The military arrives and teams up with the player to fight the army of newborns. This is the good ending. If the player cannot beat Po, they will all be killed. The military still shows up, but without the help of the player, they are overrun, and the last thing that is heard is Sergeant Miles saying, "God help us." This is the bad ending. Now, if the player decides to team up with Nunu, 2 other endings can be found. Nunu tells us that if we want to join him, we have to be reborn, and in order to do that, we need to consume custard. If the player chooses to eat the custard, they will become infected and will be seen with empty, bloody eye sockets. Nunu tells the player that they will be the greatest reborn of them all, and this is the evil ending. If the player refuses to eat the custard, Po throws the player into a vat of Tubby custard, turning him into the Crawler Tubby. As the screen goes black, Nunu can be heard saying he will obey his command. This is the regretful ending. And that is finally it for the entry of this Iceberg.
Now, there isn't much information about Slendytubbies' Guardian Collection since it hasn't been released yet. On June 23rd, 2024, it was announced that the creator behind the entire Slendytubbies series, Sean Toman, who is also known as ZeoWorks, announced that his team is launching an official game development company and would be working on a final game to conclude the Teletubbies series. That game is the Guardian Collection. There is also this disturbing model of a ranged newborn and other models I personally haven't seen before. Now look, I did say I was considering Teletubbies Worlds as part of the canon story, but after researching more, it's essentially just an online RPG and is actually a spin-off of the Teletubbies 2 game.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the last entry of the last tier of the last part of this iceberg. I want to thank you all for joining me on this ride, as it was super fun to research all of these tiers, especially since I grew up watching the Teletubbies. My next iceberg is going to be on the Nintendo iceberg, which I already have a script for but never recorded a video for, so be on the lookout for that. I don't really have much else to say except I hope that you all enjoy these videos, and I will see you on the next one.